Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia, with your host, Ben Hurl.
G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. It's really great to be back with you again this week, and I have an absolutely great guest joining us for this week's episode, Sheryl Gottschall. Sheryl has had a lifelong interest in the paranormal, which began in her teenage years. But in 1980, she began seriously studying the phenomenon of near-death experiences. And soon after, she joined the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and in 1995 hosted Dr. Ken Ring for the Brisbane leg of his Australian tour, where he presented research for his future book, Mindsight: Near-Death and Out-of-Body Experiences in the Blind. She also developed a deep interest in the UFO phenomenon, catalysed by her father-in-law's interest after he attended a UFO meeting hosting George Adamski. That's right, George Adamski in the 1960s. In 1988, she joined the Brisbane-based association UFO Research Queensland, and 3 years later took on the role of president. And then in 1992, Sheryl and her late husband, Dr. Martin Gottschall, established the first close encounter support group in Brisbane after Bud Hopkins' Australian tour. And Dr. Ring's book, The Omega Project: Near-Death Experiences, UFO Encounters, and the Mind at Large, 1992, ignited Sheryl's interest in the connections between UFOs and near-death experiences, which was now being corroborated by the witnesses that she was interviewing. And some years later, in 2012, Sheryl established the monthly Afterlife Discussions Group, where she continued to find links between UFOs and the afterlife in the stories shared. Sheryl is also the Australian representative for the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, or known as ISA, the first truly global international UFO organisation that considers what we need to prepare for confirmation that the Earth is being engaged by non-human intelligences. ISA aims to take this discussion to the highest levels of governance, including the United Nations. And Sheryl has had many paranormal experiences herself, including an NDE, a bilocation experience, out-of-body experiences, UFO sightings, a close encounter with non-human intelligences, or ETs, poltergeist activity, automatic writing, and other unexplained phenomena, all of which propel her to continue on her quest to understand what it means to be human. Sheryl's research bridges the afterlife and UFO subjects, and wanting to understand the UFO phenomenon more deeply led her to train in shamanism, which she now teaches. She speaks regularly about the UFO phenomenon and the afterlife at public meetings, conferences, community groups, schools, libraries, and has given hundreds of media interviews. She has written articles for many UFO and New Age magazines, and in 2018 was a regular guest on the weekly Spooky Action radio show and co-hosted the Strange Encounters radio show in 2019. Currently, she's a regular writer for the UFO Research Queensland bi-monthly publication, UFO Encounter. Sheryl works as a clinical hypnotherapist, teaches Reiki, art therapy, shamanism, and launched the Strange Encounters Down Under podcast in August 2021, something that I know a little bit about as well. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the show Sheryl Gottschall. Sheryl, welcome.
Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no, it's really, really great. You're one of the most fascinating people I know. So I thought I must get you onto the show so that we can talk about all the fantastic things that you've been doing over a very long time.
There's been a few.
There has. And look, when I read the intro there, it's sort of like there's so much stuff that you've been doing that obviously an hour is not enough to talk about everything in great detail, but we will try and do as best we can to sort of have a look at what you've been doing. So going right back to the early days, just tell us a little bit more about what sparked that interest for you.
Well, I've always been interested in everything unusual. And when I was a kid, I used to sit outside and look at the stars and wonder if there were other beings out there on other planets, looking at planet Earth, wondering if there's life out there, just like I was, So
Yeah.
I guess I was sort of born with that in me. And then by the time I started doing some part-time work, about age 15, I think I was, I could afford to then go and buy my own magazines, newsstand magazines. And in Australia at that time, there was really only one, which was called the Australasian Post.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Yeah, and in there, I think it was John Pinkney, who's now passed, but he's a well-known Australian author who has written quite a few books on hauntings and UFOs and mysterious Australia and things like that. And he would publish all sorts of crazy sort of things, which I thought were crazy when I was 15. And I would be fascinated to read all those stories, And then, life moved on and I got married, and that's when I met my father-in-law who had been involved with UFO Research Queensland and had actually been to see George Adamski in the Brisbane Town Hall, which was amazing. I mean, I didn't know anything about George Adamski then, right? And he told me about what a hard time he got when he was here, George Adamski, that is. And like Brisbane City Hall is huge. You can fit hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in there. And it was packed to the rims, and they had speakers outside. People were standing outside trying to listen to what was being said, etc. And poor old George Adamski was getting a really hard time with the university students who were running around with paper plates and painted green with alien faces on them and up and down. And I think a few times George Adamski walked off the stage and all that sort of thing. So,
wow.
And anyone who doesn't know who George Adamski is, he was a very early UFO contactee from the 50s and 60s era who claimed to have had many UFO contacts and wrote about it in his books.
He was quite a controversial figure, and even to this day is perhaps still a very controversial figure. But he did come out and do an Australian tour, and it was a really people were really fascinated by him, I think.
Yeah, and UFO Research Queensland, which I'm now the president of, would actually handle his Australian leg of that world tour.
Yeah, because the group has been around a very long time, hasn't it?
Yep, it was established in 1956, so it's going on quite a few decades now.
Absolutely, and it's been continuous all that time.
Yep, it's the longest running, continuously running UFO organisation in Australia, almost the world, only being beaten by the Cleveland, Ohio UFO group in the States.
Wow, so it's even older than MUFON.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think MUFON's the same age as me, 1968. I think that was the one thing that MUFON and I had in common, was we both started in the same year.
All right.
Yeah. So there must be like over that time, there must be a vast amount of records that have come in over the decades.
Oh yeah. I mean, I know that we hold at least 5,000 reports in our archives. And that's just in Queensland, the state that I'm in. And unfortunately, over the years, many other UFO organisations in Australia have closed their doors. And I'm not sure where all those records went, but we still have ours. And it's really much more common for people to have UFO sightings than what the general public realises. It's always been like that, I think. And more importantly, people also, more than we realise, more people report close encounters too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's when you even just starting a little bit of looking into it, you'll start to see that there is a vast amount of experiences out there. You know, as you say, you've and the UFO Research Queensland is quite unique in the fact that it still has all those records, and unfortunately, probably in the rest of the country, a lot of it's scattered to the wind. So that's really very unfortunate, and that's why UFO Research Queensland is such a unique and special group in Australia and if not the entire world as well.
Yeah, it's really important that we hold these records because I've always felt very responsible for people's stories to be caretakers for them and advocates because a lot of them say, I don't want to speak about this, but you're welcome to talk about my report or publish it without my details, of course. And I've had people who are very ill and they knew they were going to die, and they rang and said, I need to tell someone this before I die. And I think I just feel so responsible about that.
Yeah, it is big, and I'm trying to grab as much old information as I can, and in Victoria it is a lot harder because it's just splintered and fractured into so many different different sort of political groups and all that, and records just disappeared. Some of them got thrown out. It's just that unfortunate. But going back to the beginning again, your initial interest was the near-death experiences, which is fascinating, and I'm really curious to hear about the connection that you've drawn with that to the UFO phenomenon.
Well, actually, it's the other way around because it was 1988 that I became actively involved with the UFO Research Queensland. And it was, it was before that. You're right. It was about 10 years before that I got really seriously interested in near-death experiences.
Yeah.
Because at the time I was doing a search for God, basically. I was digging in deep and drilling down and trying to understand what our existence meant as a young woman. And so I became a member of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and I was fascinated by the stories. I bought lots of books about it. I read people's stories. And remember, IANS wasn't actually, the term near-death experiences wasn't even coined until 1975 by Dr. Raymond Moody. So, and I became involved soon after that, about 3 or 4 years after that, became a member. So, and I just got so drawn into it because, I just wanted to know what was going to be, I wanted to know more about our entire existence, basically. But that was when it took me to, I started looking into the Bible, and that was when, after about 3 years, because I was doing a home Bible study course, and every week I'd get together with a group and we'd look at the Bible and look at this and look at that, and I was reading the scriptures, and after 3 years of that, I started to see that these descriptions of angelic visitations were more akin to modern day close encounter reports, and that's when I sort of veered off into the UFO subject.
Yeah, so you sort of left the religious aspects of it at that intersection.
Yeah.
And I suppose, and that's thinking about it in a much broader way, I suppose, or even at that time it would have been fairly leading the way as well.
Yeah, and when I got involved with the UFO subject, to me, I was quite naive, I think, in that we were dealing with beings from other planets who were traveling through space, and we were seeing their craft. These days, all this, 34 years later or something, it's like No, it's just not that simple.
Isn't that simple, is it? No, and I would agree with that too. I think that's a very simplistic way to think about it. The old nut and bolting it across space is that's a very human way of thinking about things.
Yeah. But then when the abduction experiences really came to the fore during the 1990s, and for that 10-year long period of consistent reports of these close encounters with beings who were taking people against their will, which was completely opposite to how I got introduced into the UFO subject, which was about the contactees and that those aliens they're very human looking and they were our space brothers and all that. And then to have all that flipped on its head with the alien abduction experiences, it was like, wow, what the hell? What's going on?
Yeah, it was. In the early days, it was almost like tea on the lawn with them, wasn't it?
Exactly.
That's what it seemed to be. It was all very gentlemanly sort of interactions that they had with our space brothers. Then by the 90s, we've got the bug-eyed creatures that are taking us from our beds.
And let's face it, I don't disregard either of them.
No.
Right?
No.
Because I'm now, after receiving people's reports, they're describing all types of extraterrestrials. And that was one of the things that I noticed, the difference between Australian reports and the reports coming out of the US during that decade, were that the ones from Australia, they were a wide variety of descriptions, whereas the ones from the US were very typical, the little grey aliens with the inverted pear-shaped heads, big dark eyes, etc. So, but that was when I sort of started to realise, and I was hearing from people too, that there were a lot of paranormal things intertwined in the lives of these people. And after going out and interviewing every single report that came in, which you could in those days before the abductions hit, because we sort of went from 40 reports a year to like 500 reports a year.
Yeah.
I'd say, well, have you had any other strange experiences? And not even knowing myself what I was asking, they go, well, yeah, it's not UFO related, but I was sick and I ended up in hospital and I was out of my body. Or I had surgery and I left my body. And I was like, after a while, I sort of thought, wake up, Sheryl. These people are telling you something really important, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I just put it on the shelf. And it wasn't until quite a few years down the track, actually, I have to say, that I suddenly started to realize that people who report close encounters also report near-death experiences, seeing apparitions, having poltergeist activity, spontaneous mediumship, all those wide variety of other types of strange, anomalous experiences. And I think the greater UFO community started to wake up to that too. I was sort of coming to that idea, and then it was probably around 2000 that the UFO community started to, in general, have that wake up call too. And that was when I started to see the deeper connections between the afterlife and close encounter experiences, in that people were telling me some very strange things, and I was going, what does this mean? And just to give you an example, one was, probably the first one was when I owned a New Age centre, actually, when it was all very taboo to talk about those things many years ago. And I had a speaker come along one night, talk about near-death experiences. And one of the people in the audience was a woman who came up to me later, and she told me this story about what had happened to her, where she had lost her daughter, who was very, very young, been to the funeral, came home extremely distraught and upset, and just went into the bedroom, laid down, full of angst, and the next thing she knows, she's out of her body. And she's walking along a long sort of wavy path with her daughter in her hand. She gets to what is now known as the point of no return, where people can meet some type of spirit being, and they say, you can't come past here. or they'll say, if you do, you won't go back, or do you want to come past here? Do you want to leave your earthly life behind? But there's a sort of like a delineation of the experience from the current reality to another reality, which we would call the afterlife. So she came to that point, and the spirit being says, you can't come past here, but I'll take your daughter, which was really what she thought was the soul of her daughter. So after much angst and crying, she handed over her daughter to the spirit being, and then the woman turned around and started to walk back along this windy path. And as she did, she saw a UFO. And she didn't really know, I don't think she fully understood what she was seeing, but she said it was a classic spaceship that you would see in the movies.
Wow.
And the next thing she knows, she's inside. She's laying on a table. She's having these aliens are performing some sort of medical or some sort of examination on her. And remember, she's not in a physical body, right? Then she's allowed to get up and leave. And the next thing she knows, she's back in her body and wakes up on the bed. And I'm thinking, whoa, what was that I just heard?
Good, yeah. Was that the first time you'd heard that, or had you been hearing this type of thing many times?
No, that was in 1995. I heard that. Yeah, the first time.
Yeah.
And I thought, good grief, what on earth is that? Where do I put that? Where is there a box that belongs in? There wasn't at the time.
No.
There really wasn't.
Yeah.
So, and I'd heard other since then. I've heard a few other stories like that. And one was not that long ago, actually, where a woman who spoke to my afterlife group. I think she was around 60 when she was speaking, telling the story to the group. But when she was 12, she had to have her tonsils removed. So she was in hospital, and the anesthesiologist had gotten the anesthesia confused or mixed up, and she wasn't getting enough oxygen, right? So she's on the table, and she leaves her body. And then what she sees in front of her is she's in a tunnel. She sees a stream of people in front of her going towards this bright light at the end of the tunnel. And then she also sees a stream of people going back in the opposite direction. And in that stream of people is this little being. And she thought, oh, poor little thing. It's because it looked emaciated, had a big head, skinny little body, only about 3 feet tall, going back towards planet where she'd just come from, planet Earth. And anyway, so she comes back into her body, and what happened was some years later she found out about our UFO group, and she walks in the door, and as she walks in the door, someone's talking about alien abduction experiences, and they've got an image up on the screen, and it's of one of these greys. And she said to me afterwards, she said, as soon as I saw that, that's what I recognized in my near-death experience. And I went, oh, another one of those strange stories, right?
Yeah.
And I really, there's a few more, but I really have struggled to understand, how that fits into the UFO narrative, basically. And I believe it does. I don't just believe these people. And, I've heard some very strange stories, actually, which I really scratch my head and try to make sense of it, trying to get the overall picture of. But it leaves me feeling like we really don't have a handle on the UFO subject at all.
No, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, maybe it's maybe in some way that, when you pass on, perhaps you're going into another realm, another state. Maybe that's ET overlaps into that somehow, or some of them do in some capacity. So yeah there's a lot of yes.
I was going to say, I think that's highly likely. That the really big picture is that they play some sort of part, or some of them play some sort of part in human beings being on Earth. Because I've also heard stories about people who've had contact with extraterrestrial, what they call extraterrestrial. I mean, who knows what they really are, some of them. And that these ETs, these aliens, have somehow catalyzed out-of-body experiences in these people. So they obviously have, I think, a very good understanding of the part of us that doesn't rely on having a physical body. Human consciousness, or call it soul, call it spirit. I really don't know what it is. But, I've had a near-death experience myself and out-of-body experiences. So I know firsthand that I don't have to be in my physical body to be able to experience something. And I can have the same vision as I have, like I'm looking at you, as clear as that. And so I know that those experiences are real.
Maybe if you're in those states, it's more likely as well, perhaps.
Yeah. Who knows? It's a very big story.
It's a big story, and we've all been speculating about it for an incredibly long period of time with very few answers.
Yeah. So, I think we'll get them one day, but we're just sort of little bit by little bit, and we have to take the steps that when we find the answers that we can digest it. Basically, we can't bite off more of the apple than what we can chew at any one time.
No, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, tiny bites. And just because there's a whole pioneering sort of a feel about what we're sort of discussing, and when you sort of started up the first close encounter support group in Brisbane after Bud Hopkins' Australian tour, if I can speak properly. That you must have started to see, because there could have been hardly any of that in Australia at the time.
That's right. Yeah. And what happened was that after Bud had left, and we got to know him because I had organised after he spoke at a conference here in Brisbane, I had invited him to come to my home to speak to a private group. So we had, after he was a poor man, he was exhausted and starving. He walked in the door and said, "I'm hungry, what's to eat?" So he came to my home, and I had I think it was about a dozen or 15 people in my home, and we sat and we spent the night with Bud Hopkins talking about everything while I fed him, of course. And but after he left, people came out of the woodwork. We didn't know what to do, and I said, we have to start a support group for these people so they can because they really wanted to talk to other people, and only other people who'd had similar experiences, to try and put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together and make some sort of sense of it for themselves.
Yeah, because it's a completely different sport to reporting a UFO, isn't it? Like you can report a UFO to an organisation, fill in a pro forma, send in some photos, and that's one aspect of it. But when you're talking about that, it's just that rabbit hole that you dive down, and it just goes off into never-ending tunnels all over the place.
Yeah, and I think that people needed to be with other people who'd had those experiences for a variety of reasons, because they knew they wouldn't be rejected, number one, and we gave them that safe space. They knew that the other people would understand, even if they sounded crazy. It's amazing how many people ring up and say they recall a UFO hotline and go, "Oh, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I've seen a UFO." You just called a UFO hotline. No, I don't think you're crazy at all.
That's right.
This is the sort of thing. So they always felt on the outer of the UFO community, because at that time, I think it was 1992, I think he was here, that this just wasn't being spoken about that openly. Alien abductions, we were just starting for it to become globally known. That's understood. We still don't understand it, but globally known. Even though there were reports coming out as far back as Betty and Barney Hill, and previous to that as well.
Yeah, that's right. You talk about the whole abducted by fairies as being, going right back into medieval times. That this has not just been happening since the 1990s. It's been around for as long as humanity's been here.
Yeah, but what was happening in the early days of abduction experiences was UFO researchers just wanted to stick to the nuts and bolts side of it. They didn't want to have all this other weird stuff attached to it, right? Which really held the subject back.
Yeah, I think it did. You can say how big, how long, how far, how fast was it going. That's all interesting mechanics of it. But the other thing too is if you're having a UFO experience, it's very hard to capture all of that too, because you kind of stand there like a stunned rabbit in some ways. Looking at the incredible that is unfurling in front of you, not looking at wind speed and and knowing how high it is. So I understand how really difficult it is, but that other dimension is just where people don't want to, at that time, and even today to a certain extent, still don't want to go down those looking into those areas, but it is the key to understanding it. And with that, it's interesting about the near-death connection as well. So
yeah, that's a whole other avenue that really is still mostly untouched.
Yeah, nobody is. Yeah, although there was the book that was written earlier that that brings UFOs into the conversation. What was that guy's book again?
The Omega Project.
The Omega Project. Yeah, that was the one. Yeah, that sort of started to bring out the connection between NDEs and UFOs. So
yeah, no one's actually picked that up properly and run with it. I know there's been a book published by the free organisation called Beyond UFOs. I've actually got that, and there's a good collection of people's encounters in there, strange encounters. And I also know that the International Association of Near-Death Studies has now expanded its umbrella to go beyond just NDEs and include spiritually transformative experiences, which of course can be close encounter experiences too. So they probably should change their name, really. But
yeah, probably should. They probably should. Yeah. So with the support group, were you getting people who were you basically getting people who were having that classic alien abduction experience, or were you still getting close encounters with beings on the ground? How was that in that time? As in landed UFO beings around, or as opposed to I was taken in the night?
Yeah. Well, no, they weren't walking into UFOs, landed UFOs. They were there was one gentleman who he reported being taken from when he was 8 years old, I think it was. And he actually ended up speaking at one of our conferences. And he was taken through a very thick door of the house. So this is the other strange thing that comes up in these experiences. This happened quite a lot, actually. People would be taken through closed windows and bolted doors, that sort of thing. And he was actually taken out to a landed UFO in the backyard.
Right? Okay.
Yes. And he entered there, but he sort of went in. He was taken in an altered state of consciousness. This would always come up, actually, where he'd sort of be mesmerized and then go on board. And then once he was in there on one particular occasion, he sort of came to his senses, if you could say it like that, and realized that there are other people in the room with him where he was sitting, and a lot of them were adults. So by the time he contacted us, I think by then he would have been about 50, around his 50s, and but it had taken all that time in years for him to walk around with that experience rattling around inside of him before he actually reached out to our organisation, spoke to him quite a bit, and and he would just see these human beings in there that would just be in these altered states of consciousness, and he didn't know what was happening to them as a kid, and he'd know that they would be taken off into different rooms, etc. And he actually escaped that, what he calls spaceship, because by then it had lifted off and gone up into space. And but there was one particular experience where he was in a room where a brown smoke was fed into the room, which probably after we talked, possibly was some sort of decontamination process, because we were hearing a lot of that with abductees as well, where they'd be sprayed down with something before they could actually go into a craft or into an underground location or wherever it was that they were taken. And there were quite a few stories of that where they'd be, I think even Whitley Strieber talked about that in one of his experiences. He was sort of washed down and immediately dried off or something like that. And I've spoken to a woman who had that experience as well, where she was sprayed down with something and then immediately she was dry. So what we know now about viruses and the pandemics and all that sort of stuff, biological contamination, you can understand why.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, and you sort of look at it and go, well, it's just, is it just simply a washing or a cleaning? As in like they're a biological entity that could catch COVID from us, for example. That we don't want to catch their colds, so therefore we have to treat them with something. Or are they being treated not for that reason? Are they being treated for the fact that it's a treatment they need to go through before they do other experiments? Who knows?
We don't know. But I do think that your first suggestion sort of is a strong suggestive evidence that these beings are as physical as you and I.
Yeah.
And that they can catch viruses from us and they can be contaminated by these interspecies interaction.
Imagine being taken up and given them a nice stiff cold, that passes through everybody on the ship. That'd be really inconvenient.
Sure would.
So you need to isolate them. That's for sure. But the other interesting thing about abduction is that there's a lot of similarities, but they're not exactly the same, are they? Like people's stories always seem to vary a little bit. Like, well, that's my understanding. You know more about it than I do, but like there seems to be that there are common threads, but each story is unique, and it's hard to get two people telling the same story in exactly the same way.
Yeah, well, you've nailed it on the head there. That's exactly right. That there is a sort of like a core encounter, which is quite classic, and people being taken against their will to a spaceship. This is where some of the differences come. Some of them can go on to what there's clearly to them is a craft, and other people taken underground to some sort of underground location, or they're taken to some. Next thing they know, they're in some sort of circular enclosure, right? So where they're taken, and let's face it, it could be all of the above, or it could be their interpretation of it. I don't really know. Certainly, there's instruments that are spoken about, and many examinations on some sort of table. Then some of the stories get a bit different, like. There were a series of reports, I remember, where people would be then taken around the craft and they would be shown different things. They'd be taken into rooms where they could see other operators on the craft operating the ship from various different dashboards and operating equipment, which at the time had no clue what that was about, which, well, we do now. But, going back at that time, they didn't know what that was, So, and those descriptions vary, and the descriptions of the beings vary. Some people would report just dealing with the little greys. Other people would report being with the little greys and tall greys who seem to be in charge. Other people report being with those and human beings in military outfits too. So there's a whole lot of things going on there that really no one's really unpacked.
No, exactly. And since the 90s is kind of like the discovery moment for this phenomenon, and we've moved through several decades since. Are you getting these same reports today, like as were in the 90s? So are we getting those reports still? And if we are they still the same, or have they evolved again, perhaps in the near-death way, perhaps as a possibility?
Well, we're not receiving those abduction reports today.
Yeah.
In fact, we're not receiving the high amount of UFO reports today either. Could be for a variety of reasons.
Yes.
It could be that people are reporting differently because of all the social media that's available now. It could be because the experiences actually aren't taking place. It could be because people are interpreting it differently.
Yep.
Or there's so much support out there on the internet now that they don't feel they need to report it as well, right? And all along, I've always said to people, just imagine how many reports we'll never hear of because people are reporting it to their pastor or the local priest. It's demonic.
Yeah, it's demonic. The priest is copying it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a totally different perspective of looking at the whole thing, isn't it? So I say we, the paranormal community, must be missing out on a large proportion of that. And even if you were perhaps in those religious circles, you might not even talk about it because there's definitely demons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you wouldn't talk about it. You'd go, oh, they'll be the God Squad will be on my back. I don't want that.
Yeah, you don't want the.
If you're in a religious community, you don't want to ruffle feathers. That's for sure.
No, exactly right, exactly. But it must get its fair share of that as well. And I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to a couple of points there. The reports aren't coming in like they used to. So I've done a lot of historical work on UFOs, and the 70s and the 80s were just a fabulous time for UFO encounters in Australia. So we're not getting in that way. And I think that all those channels that we used to have, like the groups that existed, that's been blown apart by the ways you can report it. Like you join Facebook and there's 1,000 UFO groups on groups. I'm trying to get my fingers right. Groups on Facebook, and no one really does anything in those groups, but they are there for people to go to as a reporting mechanism. And so the other point I want to make is I think that the level of support is probably, or the level of professional support is a lot less.
Yeah, I think so. The people that have dedicated to this subject and have dedicated their lives, they're getting older and dying out. Some have walked away, but generally I think it's because they've just passed on. And that's because they came from an era when the UFO subject was brand spanking new. That was when their commitment kicked in, and these days it's very hard to get people to commit to anything, let alone a UFO organization.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Getting someone to turn up at 7:30 on a Friday night to a public hall is difficult.
Yes, exactly.
So many other distractions.
I think that the social media has done a lot of damage to the UFO subject, and it's also created new opportunities. Unfortunately, when people talk about their experiences on social media, it's not documented officially, and everything's lost. So it's just diffused out there into the community, and maybe the times when people need to. I mean, goodness, how much documentation do you need? Like maybe we've come to the end of that period in the UFO community and we're evolving into something else, which we are now because, the Pentagon has come out, right, and said, well, there are UFOs, they exist, and we've set up an office to actually investigate UFOs, which we believe aren't man-made. I mean, who would have ever thought that would have happened in our lifetime? So I think we're in a new period with the UFO subject now, and hopefully one day in the not too distant future that UFO researchers like you and I won't have anything to do.
Excellent.
We can finally go on holiday.
Exactly, yeah, because once all the the Tic Tac footage and all that started coming out, and the US military is opening up about it, and I started to feel that maybe what we're doing is maybe it's coming to an end. There's enough research, there's enough evidence, there's enough to document everything that's gone on over the years. We're getting government acknowledgement in some capacity that this is actually a real phenomena. So then you say, well, what is there left for us to do once they come out and say, this is a real thing? They are real. We all know they're real. No question about it. We're beyond all that. But what does the UFO researcher do once we reach that point where it's it's an actual phenomenon. It is real. It's totally real. You know, all you crackpots were right all along. You know, where did we go?
You can put your tinfoil hat away now.
Tinfoil hat away. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, people sort of will go, damn, he wasn't stupid after all. You know.
Yeah. Well, I actually think that there's still a lot for us to do, because we need to set aside that way of doing things now. That's had its day.
Yeah.
But I think we're on the threshold of taking the UFO phenomenon right out of the nuts and bolts era and right into the consciousness era, right, where we're looking at connections between close encounters and near-death experiences, where we're looking at what I call the close encounter package, which is where people see. I used to think that people had a close encounter and all these other paranormal things happened around it, but actually no, it's people have lives littered with anomalous experiences. And I think the thing now is to understand, why does it happen to some people and not to others? I think that's the next step.
Yeah.
And it comes up in every subject, every paranormal subject.
Because the classic thing is that, artistic people, philosophical people are the ones who have these experiences, and the guy who works on the roads is not going to have any type of encounter. I think that's, like if you're musical or artistic, then there's intrinsically with that often an interest with, in Tolkien's books and the idea of other worlds. I think if you're artistic in that way, then it's a very natural leap for you to take that belief in so many people I talked about UFOs play guitar, for example. It's very common that the people play guitar who are into the subject, and you sort of go, well, yeah, that sort of indicates that, but these other people in society, the road workers and the everyone like that who lead very straightforward lifestyles, don't have this connection to it, don't have it, and when they do have an experience, it blows their world completely apart. The road worker who has some incredible experience, he doesn't know what to do with it. He doesn't know how to cope with it. So perhaps that still exists for us in some capacity, being in some sort of support capacity. But taking it to that next level of where, who, where, why, and why some do and why some don't, that's got to be answered for sure.
Well, I would take a right turn on what you just said, because my experience is that people who, and this isn't the same for everybody, but people who report close encounters typically do, how can I say it, jobs that are, they work below their capacity, right?
Yeah.
So they're quite intelligent people. They could do more, but they choose not to. Okay. So sorry?
That's an interesting statement.
Yeah. So my experience is that I've seen a demographic in those reports of people who will work on roads, for example, but it's what they do in their spare time. So, and that was my question to them. So what do you do in your spare time? This is when we actually used to have a show on commercial radio in Brisbane. We used to run the paranormal panel for 17 years, a weekly show. And I would say to people, I wasn't on there for 17 years, but I would say to people initially, so what do you do in your spare time? And they'd tell me they would make samurai swords, or they would paint, they would carve, they would do welded artistic things. So they may work in retail, but it's their other side, the side that they don't show to the public, which is the more important. So and that's how I came to find out that these people were like, just exactly like you said, they were highly artistic, beyond statistical probability in our society, that 95% at least of people who reported close encounters were creative people, highly creative people, or they had an interest in healing.
Right.
So, and they might go off and study something like Reiki or shamanism, or they might be interested in traditional healing. There was less of that. They were more into the alternative modalities. But they became, after a while, they became spiritually engaged. So they looked at the deeper issues in their life, a bit like I did, actually. I'm going on a search for God, you know. I sort of did it the other way around, did that first and then had the experience. So, yeah, and they're also, I found that they were the letter writers, the committee members. They were the social actives. They were people who got involved in their community, who, if they ring up talkback radio shows and give their opinion about something, you know, that sort of thing, they would be bothered about it. And I also found they're highly critical of their own society, highly critical. They're the first people who will say, oh, what's going on in the world? This is crazy, you know, like that sort of thing. Everyone does that every now and then, but they're the first people who will actually speak out and say it.
Yeah, maybe in a more concentrated, regular kind of a way.
Yeah, yeah. So they're the advocates for a better life, I would say, you know. And the Roper Report, which was published in 1991 by the I can't remember the name now. Yeah, anyway, pass. But it was, they found that that the people who reported close encounters and had unusual experiences, they were the trendsetters in society. And trendsetters often go against what's current. They'll always look for the next thing, you know. So they were the trendsetters and the social influencers, which is very interesting.
In a different way to what that term means now, you know.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes.
The social is now, you know, that's not what we're talking about in terms of a social influencer, you know.
No,
you know?
And we're not talking about the woke people either.
no, you know, all the selfies and all that sort of stuff. You know, it's the people who are actually looking at change in society rather than, you know, that we all now wear red sunglasses, you know. So
yeah, I would actually describe them as the change artists.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, that's the, you know, the people who shake it up, and the troubadours, and the, you know, that's sort of very interesting, very, very interesting. So yeah, who knows, you know, where it's all going to end, and there's just so much that this all unpacks, doesn't it? You know, like
there's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot to unpack. Yeah, exactly. You know, and I really do hope that in our lifetimes that we do get some of these answers coming out, so that us as humanity and people who are around living now have those answers. And I also feel for any of the researchers who are passing away who never had those answers to those burning questions that we all have.
Well, we all play a part in because it's such a long story. It goes over eons, you know. So we're just playing our current part now in this particular time period, and then the next generation of paranormal people or UFO researchers will come forward and they'll play their part in the times they live in. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. All of it's exciting. Now, for listeners who have been totally absorbed by our conversation, how can they follow you? Where can you be contacted to discuss this, or what channels can people, join in on what Sheryl is doing?
Sure. Well, they can contact me through UFO Research Queensland through the website.
Yeah.
So just Google that. They can also find me and you on our Strange Encounters Down Under Facebook page.
Yes.
And Ben and I actually do a podcast called Strange Encounters Down Under, fortnightly one. So, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram and my name, and and say hi.
Yeah, no, that's
any strange experience, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. When it comes through, it's gold, isn't it? When you get something that someone wants to share with you, and privilege that they're sharing it with you as well.
Yes, yeah.
No worries. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sheryl, on this week's episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. It's been fascinating, and every time you and I have a conversation, I go away and think about it for probably, the next all overnight. It's just so much that stimulates the thought. So
Yes,
that's really
yeah.
good. So thank you very much.
Thank you for
very
having me.
much. Yeah, I better play the show closer.
Okay.